I Am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 381, Troy. Before discovering the Interstellar Technological Confederation, Luo Wen had already detected signs of life forms and activities in this direction. In earlier years, the swarm launched countless swarm meteors in all directions. Even though most of them were destroyed on impact, advancements in launch technology and later the introduction of electromagnetic launch platforms significantly improved their survival rates. Some of the earlier launched meteors, after prolonged journeys, traveled beyond the companion systems surrounding the Genesis system and ventured further outward, extending the swarm network along the way. Through observations, Luo Wen identified at least 2 different intelligent civilizations. However, as his main focus at the time was on the neighboring Enrican star systems, and due to various limitations, the swarm never made contact with these civilizations. Now, with information obtained from the intelligent entities, Luo Wen learned that the civilizations in that direction all belonged to the Interstellar Technological Confederation. The alien fleet discovered this time came from the outer regions of the White Grub system. They had just entered the swarm network's surveillance range when they were promptly spotted by the observer bugs. Judging from their battleship designs, it was clear that, like the Riken and Daki civilizations, this fleet primarily followed a mechanical technology path, influenced by G ships. While the designs were broadly similar, their paint schemes displayed more distinct differences. Based on images captured from multiple angles by the observer bugs and computations by the biocomputers, this fleet numbered around 200,000 ships. This was a massive force, even by the vast standards of the interstellar void, representing a truly colossal gathering. If a conflict broke out, the scale of war would far surpass any previous battle the swarm had experienced. What an enormous undertaking! Luo Wen exclaimed. Forget the logistics of assembling a fleet of 200,000 ships and the manpower and resources required, the daily consumption of food and energy alone would be staggering. Even just constructing such a fleet would demand an unfathomable amount of time and resources. When the Riken civilization, occupying an entire star system, spent decades building their fleet, they only managed to produce just over 2,000 ships. Although their relatively backward technology and the simultaneous construction of other defensive facilities contributed to this low number, it still offered a sense of perspective on what 200,000 ships represented. According to information from the Daki intelligent entities, the Daki, who control 3 star systems, have taken thousands of years to build their fleet, which still falls short of 200,000 ships. After all, maintaining these mechanical constructs incurs enormous costs in later upkeep. Without significant resources, even maintaining a small number is a challenge. Such comparisons underscored the staggering power of this newly revealed civilization. However, Luo Wen was not entirely unfamiliar with this civilization. Interestingly, this civilization shared a historical connection with the Daki Empire. When the Daki first joined the Interstellar Technological Confederation, it was this civilization that extended the invitation. At that time, the Daki's fleet was decimated by a single wave of attacks from the Crimson Kiss, after which many of their talents and resources were plundered, a significant loss for them. Of course, this was the proper way to issue an invitation. Every civilization that later joined the Confederation underwent the same process. Although that invitation ceremony occurred thousands of years ago and relations between the 2 civilizations seemed to have improved, the lingering animosity was evident, particularly from the words of the Daki Third Prince, who harbored deep resentment. Such enmities, buried deep in the bones, are not easily resolved. As for this civilization, known as Troy, its territory was located at a considerable distance from the swarm, separated by at least one other species domain. Why had they taken the stage now? Clearly, something unknown to Luo Wen had transpired. Overlord, what should we do? The target of their fleet is unequivocally us. Indeed, the Troy fleet was now only separated from the Genesis system by the Golden Horn system, which lacked any habitable planets. For the Troy civilization, it was merely a mining system. Even if they planned to establish a colony, deploying 200,000 warships seemed entirely unnecessary. According to information from the Daki intelligent entities, the Troy civilization controlled nearly 20 star systems and had a civilization history approaching 100,000 years. Among the Outer Ring civilizations, they were considered a true behemoth. Yet, their total fleet strength was approximately 500,000 warships, and committing 40% of that force at once was no trivial matter. These warships were normally dispersed across more than 10 star systems, guarding an extremely long frontier while also maintaining internal security. Despite the Troy civilization's formidable power, over the years, they had committed numerous unscrupulous acts. Take the Daki Empire, for example. If given the opportunity, they would undoubtedly strike back without hesitation. The new G race understood that even ancient grudges could eventually fade with time. Only through occasional clashes could the memories of such grievances be reinforced and hatred solidified. Therefore, they amended several rules to allow for conflicts below a certain scale. The G race would not intervene in such cases, claiming to grant greater autonomy to other races to resolve disputes on their own. Not only did they refrain from preventing such conflicts, but they also secretly incited and encouraged them. Over the last hundreds of thousands of years, more than 80% of the conflicts within the Interstellar Technological Confederation were fueled by their machinations. For Troy, committing 40% of their military strength was already their upper limit. Any further mobilization could lead to vulnerabilities within their territories. They haven't entered the Golden Horn system. Are they planning to bypass the Golden Horn system and the White Grub system? Do they intend to launch a direct attack on the Genesis system? Several intelligent entities exclaimed in astonishment while reviewing the intelligence alongside Luo Wen. Luo Wen shook his head. The fact that this civilization had managed to thrive in the Outer Ring, amidst a host of rival forces, was undoubtedly no stroke of luck. Furthermore, mobilizing nearly half of their fleet meant that the leader of this operation would certainly not be someone as flawed in character as the Daki Crown Prince. Given this, they must possess a certain level of understanding about the swarm. Much of the swarm's forces were currently stationed at solar orbital positions in a state of inactivity. With minimal effort, this could be scouted. If the Troy fleet were to brazenly traverse the space between the Golden Horn system and the White Grub system, they would effectively hand the initiative over to the swarm. Should they truly enter the Genesis system and a battle breaks out, they would find themselves surrounded by swarm forces from the Sandstorm, Golden Horn, White Grub, and Genesis systems. If pinned down, swarm forces from the neighboring and Red Ant systems could also arrive to reinforce. Although the swarm's development period was relatively short and the number of star systems they occupied was fewer than that of the Troy civilization, the swarm's population had no non-combatants. To say every member was a combat unit would not be an exaggeration. Coupled with their rapid hatching speed and exceptional resource efficiency, their strength was formidable. Currently, even the number of primordial bodies exceeding 500 meters was astonishingly high. And within the swarm's liberally constructed strongholds, numerous megastructures had been established. To be frank, the Troy civilization's plan to challenge the swarm's stronghold with a fleet of 200,000 warships seemed insufficient by any measure. Chapter 382, General Viller. Luo Wen's suspicions were correct. The Troy fleet halted its advance between the White Grub system and the Golden Horn system. The fleet set up camp, and a formation of 100 warships emerged from the main force, heading toward the Genesis system. As these warships accelerated, the surrounding starlight seemed to distort, giving the entire formation an ethereal and fleeting appearance. To those unaware, it might appear as some sort of advanced cloaking technology, but the swarm understood the truth. This was a result of the special engines on the Troy warships, capable of pushing their speeds beyond the speed of light, creating this unique phenomenon. Although the Troy civilization was an ancient power among the Outer Ring civilizations, their use of warp drives was relatively recent within the past 10,000 years. Only the newer warships were equipped with this advanced technology, while the older models still relied on sublight propulsion systems. In this expeditionary fleet of 200,000 ships, less than 20% were equipped with warp drives. This was why their cruising speed remained below the speed of light, allowing them to be monitored by the observer bug's conventional optical surveillance. What are they trying to do? Isn't it obvious? A lone detachment. This is a negotiation tactic. Exactly. By showcasing their warp drives, they aim to intimidate us and gain the upper hand in negotiations. The blades buzzed with discussion. Following several successful battles and the conversion of numerous prisoners from the Riken and Daki civilizations, the ranks of the blades had grown significantly. Unlike the relatively inexperienced rat folk, the intelligent entities of these two civilizations were battle-hardened. The Daki, in particular, boasted several warship captains with extensive real-world experience, greatly enhancing the blade's strategic capabilities. Listening to their analysis, Luo Wen nodded in agreement. The Troy likely believed the swarm had never encountered warp drives before. By showcasing this technology, they intended to deliver a veiled threat, subtly implying a technological gap and raising their negotiating leverage. General Viller, do we really need to be so cautious? With our combat capabilities, wiping out a low-level civilization should be a walk in the park. Indeed. Mobilizing such a massive force for mere negotiations won't even cover the expedition's expenses. Rubbish. That rat-folk civilization might be negligible, but the swarm is an entirely different story. You've all seen their data. If we recklessly charge in and suffer heavy losses, who will bear the responsibility? In stark contrast to the molten-faced, tri-eyed Daki, the Troy civilization's appearance was somewhat easier to accept. Their skin had a dark bronze hue with a distinctive metallic sheen. Both men and women were exceptionally robust, towering over 2 meters tall with sharply defined, massive muscles. Their imposing physique exuded an overwhelming aura. At the center of the Troy fleet, a disc-shaped warship with a diameter exceeding 5,000 meters was surrounded by numerous cylindrical warships, each around 3,000 meters long. This flagship, protected by the formation, served as the command center for the expeditionary fleet. With the fleet temporarily stationed, the flagship hosted a gathering of Troy officers engaged in a heated debate. Unlike the Riken civilization, which had struggled to fully develop even one star system and was fractured into countless factions, the Troy civilization governed nearly 20 star systems and boasted a population of nearly 200 billion. Their vast territories and immense population were several times that of the Riken. However, this massive mobilization had drawn warships from across multiple systems, exacerbating the already intricate web of factions within the Troy civilization. Relations were complex: friends of friends, enemies of friends, friends of enemies, and enemies of enemies, all interconnected in ways that defied comprehension. As the highest-ranking commander of this expeditionary fleet, General Viller found himself with a throbbing headache as he observed the chaotic scene in the meeting room. Attempting to mediate their disputes or untangle their relationships would only invite trouble. Although General Viller held immense authority, inserting himself as a peacemaker among these fractious groups would likely make him the target of endless grievances. Thus, he maintained an aloof stance, letting them argue freely. After all, there was little else to do at the moment. He might as well enjoy the spectacle. Listening to the discussions, Viller couldn't help but inwardly ridicule the situation. If this fleet of 200,000 warships could operate as a single cohesive unit, I might even consider engaging the swarm head-on to gain better leverage. But given the current state of things, we'd just be walking into a slaughter. Of course, for the sake of maintaining camaraderie among his subordinates, Viller kept his true thoughts to himself. Instead, he shot a subtle glance at one of his aides. Picking up on the cue, the aide immediately countered the argument, redirecting the room's attention and sparing Viller from having to intervene directly. Viller nodded in satisfaction, silently noting a merit for the subordinate who had spoken. However, he hadn't expected the others to refuse to back down. So what if they're peculiar? No matter how strange they are, they're still mere flesh and blood. How could they possibly contend with our steel warships? Exactly. Biotech is inherently flawed. Its structural integrity cannot compare to mechanical technology. But their numbers, fault tolerance, and repair capabilities far exceed those of our path, making them a formidable force. This response came from one of Viller's direct subordinates, who, judging by his uniform, held the rank of Major General. It wasn't surprising, though, as the meeting was of the highest level, and only those with at least Brigadier General rank were permitted entry. Humph, trash in great numbers is still trash, the Troy officer sneered dismissively. He was a lieutenant general with strong backing from a faction, showing no hesitation in challenging the subordinate of the expedition's supreme commander. The Daki thought the same, and yet they still slinked away in disgrace. The incident with the Daki third prince, despite many precautionary measures to conceal it, had leaked out. After the G-race expressed interest in the swarm, intelligence organizations from countless factions had been monitoring the situation. Although they couldn't observe the battlefield firsthand, they had pieced together a rough account of the events through various channels. Among older civilizations, the details were practically common knowledge. 2,000 warships, despite flawed intelligence and leadership errors, managed to hold out for so long and only lost half their fleet. Was that some kind of game to you? And you conveniently ignore that the swarm had no intelligence either and lost more than half their forces at the start. We don't have a Crimson Kiss to use as an invitation tool this time, you know. This rebuttal didn't come from one of Viller's subordinates but from another lieutenant general, who actively joined the escalating argument. So what? If even garbage like the Daki could go toe-to-toe with the swarm using the forces of a single star system, then with our strength, we wouldn't need the Crimson Kiss to crush them. We could do it with sheer force alone. The opposing lieutenant general's aggression was on full display. Are you truly that dense, or are you pretending to be? The Riken system was barely touched by the swarm's influence at the time, and now we're heading straight for their main base. The forces we'll face there, in both quantity and quality, are on an entirely different level. Chapter 383, Quarrel. The Troy officer's statement wasn't entirely wrong. Over the past few years, the swarm had rapidly deployed a massive number of combat units across several nearby star systems. After nearly 2 decades of dormancy in solar orbital positions, these units had now fully matured. According to the G-Race's latest intelligence, the swarm had relatively few 3,000-meter class combat units comparable in size to conventional warships, most of which were concentrated in the Genesis system. However, the number of combat units exceeding 500 meters had surpassed 10 million. Coupled with the swarm's bad habit of hiding assets within planetary interiors, their concealed strength was virtually impossible to predict. Had the Daki possessed this more accurate and reliable information back then, they likely wouldn't have dared to showcase the Crimson Kiss as an invitation tool. We hold a speed advantage. We can conduct guerrilla tactics, wear them down, and eliminate them piece by piece. Even if we can't directly harm them, we can force them to consolidate, slowing their development, proposed another lieutenant general. This officer appeared to have carefully studied the swarm and offered a strategy that, while devious, could indeed cause some trouble for them if implemented. Viller considered the suggestion seriously but ultimately rejected the tempting plan. The complex environments within star systems, coupled with the unknown limits of the swarm's capabilities, rendered such an approach too risky. Neither the Riken nor the Daki civilizations had been able to push the swarm to its full potential. What other surprises the swarm might have, like the sudden introduction of their energy cannons, which had decisively turned the tide in past battles, remained an unsettling mystery. Viller, holding a prestigious position, wasn't willing to gamble. Losing the wager would be a minor issue compared to jeopardizing his life and reputation in the process. Moreover, this operation was clearly influenced by the G-Race, who were notorious for their hidden agendas. Whatever motives they harbored this time were undoubtedly selfing. Their intentions, however, were relatively transparent. Since neither the Riken nor the Daki could determine the swarm's limits, they sought to send a stronger adversary to probe further. But the Troy Empire wasn't particularly eager to serve as this adversary. What puzzled Viller even more was why the G-Race, given their apparent interest in the swarm, refused to engage directly. Although the Interstellar Technological Confederation was rife with internal conflicts, real authority ultimately stemmed from raw strength. The G-Race was incredibly powerful. Even if the swarm's capabilities were multiplied tenfold or 100-fold, they still wouldn't be a match for the G-Race. While the G-Race claimed to abstain due to protections for nascent civilizations within the Confederation, Viller dismissed this justification with scorn. In intercivilizational dealings, strength was the only truth that mattered. If the G-Race truly wanted to act, they could easily fabricate a pretext to bypass these rules. They'd done it before. Once they acted and cemented the results, no other civilization would challenge the galaxy's strongest faction to defend a primitive race. The reality was harsh. Weakness was the original sin, and every civilization should accept this truth. The swarm itself wasn't innocent, either. It seemed to have emerged out of nowhere, with a technological trajectory utterly alien to the norms of established civilizations. If the G-Race decided to intervene, the rest of the Confederation would simply follow behind, hoping to scavenge benefits. No one would protest. However, the G-Race's continued behind-the-scenes maneuvering was deeply unsettling. They were undoubtedly withholding some critical, possibly decisive, information about the swarm. This secrecy amplified Viller's apprehension. The officers now arguing in the conference room were at least brigadier generals, each one a veteran of hard-fought battles. The brainless ones had long since died on the battlefield. Viller trusted that, after reviewing the intelligence, most of them could reach the same conclusions. That said, the one who had started the commotion was indeed among the minority, arrogant and foolish to a fault. This was why Viller had instructed his subordinates to shut him down, hoping it would silence him. Viller had underestimated the sheer arrogance of that particular officer. However, as the argument escalated, it became clear that the newcomers joining the fray were far more cunning. None of them truly wished to probe the swarm's full strength, but they naturally split into two camps and escalated the dispute not to alleviate boredom, but with calculated intent. Even within Viller's own faction, there were varying degrees of loyalty, to say nothing of a 200,000 strong fleet drawn from over a dozen star systems. While everyone was content with the current status quo, plans never kept pace with changes in reality. If circumstances shifted and they truly had to engage the swarm in battle, who would take the vanguard? Who would handle the riskiest missions? As the highest commander of the expedition, Villar's faction and its close allies were undoubtedly pleased with their positions. However, those less aligned or even hostile were likely feeling uneasy. It was only natural for them to worry about being sent to bear the brunt of danger. Faced with potential future risks, it was better for these factions to act preemptively. Everyone was fully aware of the fleet's intricate web of relationships. By continuously creating friction and conflict, they could make Villar's position increasingly difficult. Undermining his authority and portraying him as unfit for command would help justify any future acts of insubordination. This was an open scheme, one they didn't fear Villar uncovering. Villar shook his head with a wry smile. It was a situation with no easy resolution. Even if he managed to resolve this particular dispute, the underlying tensions would persist, and these people would inevitably stir up new trouble. Still, he understood their motivations. It was all about survival and power. If their roles were reversed, he admitted he might be causing just as much trouble. In his younger years, when he'd been clawing his way up the ranks, he'd been a master of such tactics. For now, all he could do was hope the mission would proceed smoothly, that no unexpected disasters would arise, and that everyone would complete their tasks peacefully. A win-win situation, with no one needing to be burdened with undue stress, was his ideal outcome. While we have a speed advantage, we lack range superiority. Additionally, aside from their solar orbital bases, most of the swarm's other bases are hidden underground on their planets. Unless we destroy the planets themselves, it's nearly impossible to completely wipe out their forces. Meanwhile, their solar orbital bases are heavily fortified. They don't even need to match our speed by simply defending, they could nullify our advantage. But we could still isolate them, cutting them off and turning their bases into islands. Are you an idiot? Even if you isolate them, can you wipe them out entirely? And do you think the swarm operates like us, requiring logistical support? They can just sit in their solar orbital positions and continuously grow stronger through division and evolution. Isolating them does nothing, they don't even want to come out. True. According to the intelligence, the swarm is incredibly reclusive. Without military provocation, they can remain in their bases for decades or even centuries without needing to interact. Interact? With what? The units out there are all bioweapons. Bioweapons don't need to interact. The real swarm leaders are hiding who knows where. Even with the G-Race's resources, they still haven't located them. Unless we find and eliminate those hidden entities, destroying countless bioweapons will mean nothing. Watching the heated arguments, Villar adjusted his mindset and relaxed. Let them argue, he thought. It's something to do, and it keeps them busy. For now, he saw no harm in letting them vent. It was as good a way as any to pass the time. Chapter 384, Warp Drive. The vast army of the Troy Empire appeared to be bearing down on the Genesis system, but in reality, they were still nearly 8 light-years away. However, their warp drives were indeed impressive. These drives were based on the main engine technology found aboard the treasure starship unearthed years ago by the Reincarnated, a ship originally planted by the G-Race. It was a system they had never fully understood. Warp drives represented an advanced application of gravitational technology. By converting energy into gravity, the drives distorted space, compressing it ahead of the spacecraft and expanding it behind. The axis of this distortion determined the ship's direction of travel. Within this configuration, the ship traveled along a stable zone of flat spacetime called a warp bubble, effectively riding a wave of spatial distortion. From the perspective of the warp bubble, the spacecraft was stationary relative to its local flat spacetime. It was the bubble itself that moved, circumventing the conventional limitation that an object cannot exceed the speed of light within its local frame. Years ago, the Troy Empire had also unearthed a G-Race ship, but the experience had been akin to a calculated ploy. Like a tantalizing bait-and-switch, the Troy were allowed to toy with the ship for a few days, enough to spark their curiosity, only for it to be taken back. If they truly wanted to unlock the secrets of the warp drive, they'd need to pay a steep price. For the G-Race, this price was measured in points, astronomical sums accumulated through massive contributions of scientific manpower and resources. In the early days after being invited to join the Confederation and suffering their first major losses, the Troy civilization retained a great deal of vigor. Fueled by resentment, they believed they could crack warp drive technology on their own, using the data they had collected from studying the treasure starship. However, warp drives represented a critical technological watershed, defining whether a civilization could expand across multiple star systems while maintaining stability. Even the inherently gifted G-race had struggled with this technology for tens of thousands of years, plunging their civilization into a dark age that severely weakened them. Even with the physical drive system as a reference, reproducing it was far from straightforward. Moreover, the so-called treasure starship was nothing more than a seductive trap. The original G-race would never so easily give away their technology for free. While the drives were designed to be nearly impossible to reverse engineer, there was always a slim chance so the bait was poisoned. The warp drive on the ship was a high-quality imitation, representing one of the many dead ends the G-race had encountered during their development process. Any civilization attempting to reverse engineer it would only stray further from the true path. Almost every external civilization had fallen into this trap, not just the Troy. Each one believed they were uniquely brilliant, determined to solve the mystery on their own. But after wasting years of time and enormous resources, they ultimately had to face reality. Only after paying a colossal price to purchase the genuine technology did they realize they'd been duped. The Troy were no exception to this pattern. At this moment, the Troy Empire's greatest desire was to crush the G-race. However, the vast disparity in strength left them with no choice but to endure, silently nursing their hatred. The G-race, of course, had no intention of directly drawing this hostility toward themselves. As more civilizations fell victim to the G-race's schemes, attitudes among those who had already been deceived began to shift under the G-race's subtle manipulation. Each time a new civilization got caught in the trap, the older victims found themselves taking a certain malicious pleasure in their suffering. A twisted dynamic emerged. Having paid the price themselves, these older civilizations felt compelled to ensure that others also bore the same cost. Over time, the G-race no longer needed to intervene. These early victims would actively maintain the cycle of exploitation. After the original G-race disappeared, the successor new G-race naturally continued this fine tradition in its entirety. The impact of this trap on civilizations was enormous. Even a long-established power like the Troy Empire, with a history spanning nearly 100,000 years, had only managed to exchange for the warp drive technology about 10,000 years ago. This alone illustrated how ruinous the scheme truly was. What the Troy acquired was merely the basic warp drive technology. Meanwhile, with the contributions of hundreds of alien researchers over millennia, the G-race had refined the technology to incredibly advanced levels. However, they would never offer the complete solution up front. Instead, they divided it into multiple tiers, each requiring astronomical investments to obtain. It was an insatiable sinkhole of resources. Civilizations tens of thousands or even over 100,000 years older than the Troy found themselves at similar levels of technological advancement in this area, which made the difficulty of further exchanges all the more apparent. Even so, obtaining even the basic warp drive technology represented a massive leap forward. It was a critical breakthrough that elevated the entire civilization's technological level. With it, the Troy could increase their warship speeds from sublight levels to twice the speed of light. For comparison, while the Daki Empire needed more than a decade to travel from the outer regions of the Golden Horn and White Grub systems to the Genesis system, the Troy fleet's detachment achieved the journey in just 4 years. This was the difference warp drives made. In the detachment of 100 warships traveling faster than light, personnel emerging from cryosleep began to awaken. 2 muscular Troy stood on the bridge, one in front and one slightly behind. "Major General Buller, do you think this mission will go smoothly?" The latter, a female Troy with a concerned expression, suddenly spoke in a soft, incongruous voice that didn't match her imposing physique. "Don't worry, Kai. The fact that we've traveled this far unimpeded already reflects the swarm's intentions," Buller replied firmly, turning to pat the slightly shorter female officer behind him. She was his adjutant, and while she too was a towering figure with prominent muscles and a well-developed chest, she was considered a stunning beauty by Troy standards. Hearing his words, Kai's chiseled face betrayed her surprise. "Major General, we're traveling at faster than light speeds. While the basic warp drive technology still has some flaws, aren't the swarm just a primitive civilization? They probably can't even detect us, can they?" Buller nodded. "You're correct, Kai. Based on the data, that should indeed be the case. While they're numerous, they haven't demonstrated higher-level technological capabilities, so logically, they're not a threat. Yet, for some reason, I have a feeling they can detect and intercept us. You know how accurate my instincts are. They've saved us multiple times." Kai furrowed her brow. "While I find it hard to believe a primitive civilization could achieve this, I trust your instincts, Major General." However, if your hunch is correct, it means our opponent is even more formidable, and this mission will be even more dangerous. Kai, Buller said with a faint smile, as I mentioned earlier, if my instincts are right, they indeed have the capability to intercept us. But the fact that they haven't acted means they're willing to talk. I suspect they've received information about the Confederation from the Daki, but those fools likely mixed truth with lies. The swarm probably wants to learn more through us, which is why we'll remain safe. Chapter 385, Buller. Though Buller spoke with confidence, even with a firm grasp of the situation, he couldn't help feeling a hint of unease until the task was fully accomplished. Of course, such apprehension was something he would never show outwardly. This mission was one he had volunteered for, and at less than a century old, Buller had already been promoted to the rank of Major General, a rare achievement at his age. To continue advancing, however, there were only two viable paths: gaining seniority or achieving great merit. Buller was highly ambitious, aspiring to climb even higher, and therefore saw no value in simply waiting to accumulate seniority. The Troy Empire, though a powerful force within the Outer Ring civilizations, was generally stable despite having a few enemies and latent threats, leaving few opportunities for major accomplishments. This mission to invite the rat folk and swarm into the Confederation was just such an opportunity. However, General Viller, the supreme commander of the expedition, decided against using the traditional coercive methods of invitation this time, opting instead for a genuine diplomatic approach. While Buller understood Viller's reasoning, it dashed his hopes of earning distinction through a triumphant military engagement. Forced to take a different route to success, Buller seized on the chance to distinguish himself. At the time, General Viller sought an envoy of sufficient status to act as a liaison. Yet such a task deep behind enemy lines was one of the riskiest imaginable. Failure could easily mean death. While successful completion promised substantial recognition, the danger dissuaded most candidates, especially those of high rank who had little to gain and everything to lose. As Viller continually raised the stakes, Buller stepped forward. Though his rank as brigadier general at the time technically fell short of the status ideal for this mission, in the absence of higher-ranked volunteers, Buller became the only viable choice. Promoted to major general even before departing, Buller considered this a preemptive reward for the merits he was expected to earn, elevating his position to make him a more suitable representative. In fact, Viller had initially proposed awarding Buller the full merits of the mission in advance, promoting him directly to lieutenant general. This would not only reflect the Troy Empire's respect for the diplomatic exchange but also acknowledge the mission's inherent dangers. Many doubted Buller would even survive to return. However, this plan met with fierce opposition and was ultimately shelved. Despite this, Buller was more than satisfied. Opportunities to rise 2 ranks above Major General were exceedingly rare, and such missions were virtually 1 in a million. Though the mission appeared perilous, Buller's analysis and instincts led him to believe the risks were not as high as they seemed. Once the fleet departed, he remained on edge, prepared to flee at the first sign of trouble. Better to face a military tribunal than lose his life. Yet as the detachment passed uneventfully through the outer regions of the Golden Horn and White Grub systems, his confidence grew. It seemed the odds were in his favor. The primary limitation of the basic warp drive technology was its instability. The warp bubble it generated lacked sufficient stability, making it highly susceptible to external interference. Interception was relatively straightforward. An unstable gravitational field generated ahead of the ship's trajectory could disrupt the warp bubble, either forcing the warship out of warp or, in severe cases, disintegrating it entirely. However, while the concept seemed simple, execution required advanced technology. First, the ability to detect fleets traveling within warp bubbles was essential. If you couldn't even see them, interception was out of the question. Second, the ability to precisely calculate their trajectory and position was critical. Due to differences in warp drive technology across civilizations and even between production stages and manufacturing facilities within the same civilization, each engine's performance varied. These disparities made prediction and interception exceedingly complex. For Buller, this variability was a small reassurance. Unless the swarm had achieved parity with warp drive technology, they couldn't intercept the fleet, and thus far, intelligence suggested the swarm lacked such capabilities. However, the possibility of encountering the unexpected always loomed, and Buller's instincts, though often reliable, left room for doubt. Nevertheless, as the detachment drew closer to their destination, he allowed himself a measure of cautious optimism. If a warship's speed cannot be precisely calculated, determining its position becomes meaningless. Describing this as missing by a mile wouldn't even begin to capture the issue at speeds measured in light years per hour. A warship could travel millions of kilometers in the blink of an eye. Even after pinpointing a target's location, successfully attacking it remains a monumental challenge. One approach is to set up a trap by calculating the ship's trajectory in advance. However, this requires the trap to be highly concealed. If the target detects it even slightly ahead of time, the warship can make a minor course adjustment, and within seconds, it will deviate by tens or even hundreds of thousands of kilometers from its original path. To account for such potential deviations, the trap would need either a massive range or immense destructive power. Yet, such measures would inherently compromise its stealth, creating a paradoxical challenge. The alternative is direct interception, the preferred method in advanced civilization warfare. This approach relies on a technological advantage. For instance, if Party A's warship travels at twice the speed of light, but Party B's gravitational bombs can move at 3 times the speed of light, Party B can catch up with Party A's ship and force it to exit its warp bubble. Thus, the ease of interference only applies to the technologically superior side. As technological advancements continue, the weaker side may find themselves unable even to escape when faced with overwhelming superiority. However, this doesn't mean the technologically inferior side has no chance against a superior foe. Before warp drive technology reaches a certain maturity, star systems remain challenging terrain due to their numerous gravitational sources, which serve as natural interference traps. Unstable warp bubbles are highly fragile in the presence of such gravitational forces. In such environments, if the weaponry of both sides is somewhat evenly matched, the technologically weaker side still has a fighting chance. Of course, if the stronger side's capabilities are vastly superior, such as resolving all issues of warp bubble stability, their warships can maintain high speeds even within a star system, leaving the weaker side utterly outclassed. Yet Buller couldn't shake a lingering doubt. The swarm was unlikely to have reached such an advanced level of warp drive technology, yet his intuition insisted they could intercept Troy warships traveling within warp bubbles. Though he had great confidence in his instincts, he knew that if this guess was wrong, the mission's true challenge would come next. Clearing this hurdle would be crucial to ensuring the success of the operation. As the Troy fleet neared the asteroid belt at the outskirts of the Genesis system, the ships exited their warp bubbles of their own accord. This was not only to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings but also because Troy's basic warp technology was incapable of functioning properly within star systems. This marked the mission's second major hurdle. In the sublight speed environment of the star system, their fleet lacked a firepower advantage and was outnumbered. Even with a slight speed advantage, they could easily be encircled by the swarm's massive forces. Whether the swarm truly intended to negotiate or not would soon become evident. As the Troy warships slowed down and cautiously passed through the asteroid belt, they silenced all weapon and radar systems. Buller was gambling, knowing full well that this move cost them some face. But in another civilization's territory, keeping weapons charged and indiscriminately sweeping with radar would be an egregious breach of etiquette, potentially viewed as outright provocation. If they genuinely wanted to negotiate, it was better to adopt the most humble posture possible. For Buller, the priority was completing the mission and returning home alive. Any loss of pride in the process was a small price to pay. Chapter 386, Encryption. Shutting down the weapons systems was one thing, but deactivating the radar system was an entirely different matter. It was akin to venturing blindfolded into an enemy stronghold, essentially surrendering one's fate. If the enemy approached with a weapon in hand, you wouldn't even realize it until it was too late. What good was speed in such a situation? If the swarm harbored any ill intentions, Buller and his fleet would likely meet their end here. Major General, do you think the swarm has detected us? Kai-Ai's usually resolute face now bore an expression of deep worry, her thick black eyebrows curving in uncharacteristic distress. Buller shot Kai-Ai an annoyed glance, visibly displeased. He was beginning to regret his earlier decision to fast-track her promotion to adjutant. At the time, her exceptional beauty and outstanding capabilities had impressed him. However, it was only now that he realized her mental fortitude left much to be desired. The situation was already tense enough, and Buller's legs were trembling slightly beneath his stoic exterior. Maintaining an air of calm was draining all his energy. He simply didn't have the bandwidth to console someone else. Kai-Ai, stop asking meaningless questions, he snapped, his tone sharp. Respecting our opponent is respecting ourselves. If the swarm, in their home base, cannot detect us after we exited the warp bubble, then what reason do we have for even being here? Chastened by Buller's rebuke, Kai-Ai flushed with embarrassment. Despite her striking appearance by Troy standards, she was far from useless. Quickly, she engaged in self-reflection and worked to adjust her mindset. As time passed, the fleet drew closer to the swarm's outermost base. Observing the majority of swarm units remaining in dormancy and seeing only a small, non-aggressive force intercepting them, Buller finally let out a breath of relief. His confidence rapidly grew. The swarm remained an enigmatic entity, and even the powerful G-race hadn't managed to uncover their true form. If Buller could simply lay eyes on a real member of the swarm and return alive to provide a detailed sketch, it would already be an impressive feat. The approaching units were classic examples of the swarm's biological weaponry, well documented in the Confederation's records. The swarm seemed particularly fond of this type of design. In fact, many alien researchers had concluded that the octopus-like shape was an extremely efficient combat configuration. According to the data, these units were primarily composed of soft materials, providing excellent defense against physical impacts. Their surface contained special compounds capable of weakening and reflecting energy-based weaponry, giving them significant resistance to energy attacks. Additionally, their flexible tentacles allowed for multidirectional movement, enabling exceptional agility in confined spaces. The tentacles also offered formidable melee combat capabilities. With the exception of relatively weaker long-range firepower and endurance, these units had no major flaws. This had been vividly demonstrated when 10 or so Daki warships, spread out in formation, had barely managed to hold their ground against over 100 500-meter octopus units. But when a handful of these units managed to close the distance, supported by smaller swarm units, the Daki found themselves in utter disarray. Without timely reinforcements, the fleet might have been annihilated entirely. This footage had shocked the alien civilizations with access to it. For most of them, space battles were contests of massive fleets exchanging long-range artillery fire. Even at close quarters, their tactics didn't deviate much, perhaps supplemented by attacks from fighter or drone swarms. The swarm, however, had introduced a novel element, melee combat. In a field dominated by long-range bombardments, their ability to engage in close-quarters combat with terrifying precision was an unsettling anomaly. Alien civilizations had long focused on improving weapon range, firepower, and rate of fire, along with enhancing warship mobility, armor, and radar systems. Close combat capabilities, however, had never been a priority, constrained as they were by the structural limitations of traditional warships. Yet the swarm's biological designs effortlessly circumvented these limitations, enabling them to excel where others couldn't even compete. This fundamental difference left the galaxy's established powers grappling with an uncomfortable realization: their conventional strategies were ill-suited to counter the swarm's unique combat approach. Although the swarm had always been at a disadvantage in terms of mobility, struggling to close the distance to their enemies, their exceptional melee capabilities had nonetheless drawn significant attention from other civilizations. The swarm had effectively pioneered a new combat paradigm, proving the feasibility of a theoretical possibility. While many alien civilizations dismissed the swarm's effectiveness, they didn't extend the same skepticism to themselves. They believed that if they could resolve the issue of mobility, such a melee-oriented combat style might yield impressive results. The analogy was simple: a martial artist with unparalleled agility could easily wreak havoc amidst a formation of spear-wielders. Consequently, numerous projects were initiated among different civilizations to explore this new approach. Whether these endeavors would bear fruit remained uncertain. As the two groups drew closer, Buller ordered his fleet to broadcast their mission objectives in Reincarnated. This was a necessary compromise, given the enigmatic nature of the swarm's language and communication systems. According to available data, intercepted swarm communications were exceedingly rare, and their content remained undeciphered to this day. It was hypothesized that the swarm used a spectrum-based encryption language, composed of a staggering array of primary, secondary, and tertiary colors far beyond the perception of most civilizations. Without the corresponding reading apparatus, even capturing the full communication stream was impossible, let alone decoding it. Such specialized devices were so advanced that even the G-race couldn't construct them. This was because developing them required not only profound knowledge of biology and biomimetics but also specific biological materials that were exceptionally rare. Take, for example, pre-swarm Luowen and his fellow humans from Earth. Most of them could only perceive 3 primary colors, which could combine to produce roughly 1 million distinct hues. A small subset of people were dichromat, capable of perceiving only about 10,000 colors. Even rarer were tetrachromats, individuals who could perceive a 4th primary color. These people could see an estimated 1 billion colors, significantly more than the average trichromat. For every additional primary color that a visual system could perceive, the number of observable colors increased exponentially. A tetrachromat could see 1 billion colors, but what about a pentachromat, a hexachromat, or a creature capable of perceiving 30 primary colors? This alone illustrated the complexity of the swarm's encryption methods. To decode such communications, one would first need to comprehend these unseen primary colors. It was difficult enough for a trichromat to describe their world to a dichromat. Attempting to convey the vastly richer world of a tetrachromat to a trichromat was even more futile. For a trichromat to study and understand the tetrachromatic world, they would first need a pair of tetrachromatic eyes. Similarly, understanding the world of 30 primary colors would require eyes capable of perceiving all 30 colors. To date, the only known creatures in this starfield capable of perceiving so many colors were members of the swarm. As such, decoding the swarm's encrypted communications would require capturing a swarm unit equipped with 30 color vision. Such units were exceedingly rare even within the swarm itself. The Confederation had yet to identify their appearance, and even if one were captured, the swarm's genetic locks presented another significant challenge. It could be said that while the swarm lagged behind in overall technological development, they had far surpassed the mechanically inclined civilizations of the Confederation in certain branches of biological science. Bowler sighed to himself. Perhaps this was the real reason why the G-race was so invested in this mysterious Outer Ring civilization. Chapter 387, Arrival. Your Majesty, are we really going to join this so-called Interstellar Technological Confederation? Asked a blade named Danton. Once a brigadier general in his former life during the post-Sarah era, Danton had been converted into an intelligent entity under the swarm. While all intelligent entities were technically derivatives of the swarm network and thus equal in principle, in practice, there were differences in access and authority. Following Luo Wen's directives, the swarm had established a virtual royal court, complete with various positions and hierarchies. Externally, this gave rise to a structured class system. The visiting delegation from Troy included a major general. Following the principle of equivalence, the swarm naturally wouldn't deploy someone like Sarah or Morgan to meet them. Even figures like Tella or Marlene wouldn't appear. Instead, a counterpart of equivalent rank was chosen, namely Danton. Of course, replied Sarah. Among the countless intelligent entities within the swarm, only a select few had the privilege of communicating directly with the Overlord outside of emergencies. Sarah was one of them. Many questions and uncertainties from the swarm were brought to her for clarification, and she relayed answers from the Overlord. Sarah's high status, proximity to the Overlord, and the fact that many intelligent entities were converted ratfolk combined to make her position as the Empress of the Virtual Royal Court a fitting title. But won't this reveal many of the swarm's secrets? Danton asked with concern. His core mission of serving the swarm drove him to think solely about its well-being, raising questions and suggestions based on the information at his disposal. Danton, every interaction is mutual. We may reveal some secrets, but they, in turn, will reveal much to us. Sarah's response echoed the philosophy that Luo Wen himself had explained to her when she once posed the same question. Although Luo Wen was naturally cautious, he was never reckless. In this scenario, simple evasion wouldn't suffice. No matter how strong the swarm had grown, or how thoroughly they could crush the Daki civilization and even the Troy fleet, they remained a small player within the Interstellar Technological Confederation. Luo Wen was keenly aware of his limits. The Confederation consisted of over 200 civilizations spanning thousands of star systems, a massive entity rife with internal conflicts that hindered unified action. Even so, they were far beyond what the swarm, with fewer than 10 star systems under its control, could hope to challenge. Luo Wen understood this perfectly. While the swarm's potential was boundless, that potential required time to materialize. During the previous encounter with the Daki, the Confederation's involvement could be dismissed as ignorance. But now, with the Troy civilization reaching out, such excuses were no longer plausible. If it came down to an all-out confrontation, the swarm, at its current level, could hold its own against the 200,000 ship Troy fleet. Even if the entire Troy civilization mobilized, or if the Daki joined them to wage a two-front war, Luo Wen wouldn't flinch. But as Luo Wen often reminded himself, these were small players. Even if the swarm defeated them, what then? Striking such a blow would provoke the Confederation as a whole. The G-race, who seemed to view the swarm with particular interest, would likely act as enforcers. The next visitors might not be minor powers like Troy but rather one of the long-established, formidable civilizations from the inner circle. Fortunately, the Troy fleet commander seemed rational enough. He understood that while the swarm's strength was insignificant to the Confederation as a whole, it was far from something the Troy civilization could handle alone. If the Troy fleet were to suffer catastrophic losses here, even if they provided the Confederation with critical battlefield data and intelligence on the swarm, the immediate consequence for the Troy would be annihilation. While the swarm might face retribution later as a cautionary example, it would be too late for the Troy, they would already be dead. This delicate balance of power underscored the significance of the encounter now unfolding. Both sides seemed to understand that a head-on collision would lead to mutually assured destruction, even if the aftermath would vary. For now, diplomacy was the only sensible path forward. Given this sentiment, Luo Wen was inclined to take the opportunity to join the Interstellar Technological Confederation as long as the conditions weren't overly unreasonable. Membership would mean the swarm would be protected by the Confederation's rules. Even if the G-race or other civilizations harbored ill intentions, they would be less likely to act openly. Any covert schemes would likely also diminish, as attacking an ally was generally frowned upon and carried reputational risks. Of course, this plan was contingent on there being no overwhelming profit to be gained from undermining the swarm. Luo Wen still didn't fully understand what about the swarm had drawn the G-race's interest. For now, his best course of action was to obscure the true nature of the swarm network and address any vulnerabilities that had been previously overlooked. Meanwhile, the Troy detachment found themselves completely surrounded by massive primordial bodies. These behemoths, their bodies soft and pliant, adhered to the Troy warships like oversized patches of biological glue, adding an extra layer of bulk to the ships. Buller and his officers, having seen footage of these creatures in combat, understood their ferocity. Despite the fact that Troy warships were significantly larger and more advanced than their Daki counterparts, the Primordial's 500-meter-long, muscular tentacles could easily pummel even the sturdiest hull into scrap. The Troy fleet, under this ominous protection, inched forward, spending nearly a month traversing the asteroid belt before finally reaching the A-11 swarm base. The reception at A-11 was far from ceremonious. The surroundings were utilitarian, if not outright crude. Buller, accompanied by Kai and several diplomats, disembarked in protective suits. They found themselves walking across a purple-gray fleshy fungal carpet, led forward by a handful of 2-meter-tall juvenile swarm bodies. "Major General, this stuff is disgusting." Kai's deep, muscular voice carried a tone of disdain as she eyed the squishy ground beneath their feet. "Focus on the task, not the details." Buller snapped, though he too was struggling to maintain his composure. Like most Troy, his robust physique came with its own quirks. The dense musculature that allowed them to withstand small-caliber kinetic rounds also meant they were heavy over 300 pounds, regardless of gender. This unique physiology was tied to their home environment, which consisted of an ecosystem dominated by hardness and rigidity. Their natural preference for solid terrain made the soft, spongy surface beneath them almost intolerable. It wasn't just the aesthetic repulsion, the unstable footing affected their balance and coordination. Each step sank into the fungal carpet, which made Buller worry about accidentally puncturing it. Getting splattered with biological fluid was a minor concern compared to the potential for triggering a diplomatic incident. Fortunately, whether due to A-11's low gravity or the surprising resilience of the fungal carpet, his fears didn't materialize. The surface, though pliant, was tough enough to support their weight without breaking. Nevertheless, the uneven terrain left Buller feeling increasingly nauseous and lightheaded. If not for the lack of an alarm from his protective suit, he might have suspected the swarm of poisoning them. Suppressing their discomfort, the Troy delegation did their best to maintain composure. Eventually, the group entered a tunnel and followed it into a massive underground cavern. The chamber was dimly lit, populated by a few 2 or 3 meter juvenile swarm units, and, most intriguingly, 3 humanoid figures. Buller's pulse quickened, and the rush of adrenaline worsened his dizziness, but his excitement overrode his physical discomfort. Could these humanoids be the true form of the swarm? He might very well be the first in the Confederation to witness their appearance firsthand. This moment, he realized, would be one for the history books. Chapter 388, The Meeting. Standing over 2 meters tall, clad in seamless keratin armor and sporting jagged bone spikes from their ramming horns, the 3 humanoid figures exuded a brutal aesthetic of primal violence. 2 were male and 1 female, distinguishable by their body shapes and the subtle differences in their armor. The female's frame was slightly slimmer, her armor less angular, and her bone spikes more restrained. So, this is the true form of the swarm. Buller thought, suppressing a sigh. From their protective suits alone, it was clear that this was not a race to be trifled with. Yet, a faint sense of disdain began to creep into his thoughts. He found the swarm's protective suits overly ornate, bordering on impractical. A suit capable of shielding a body from the radiation of space wasn't exactly rare for an interstellar civilization, but it certainly wasn't cheap either. All this flashy extravagance, does it serve any purpose other than driving up manufacturing costs? Or do they really plan to board enemy ships and engage in melee combat? To Buller, this reeked of outdated thinking. What era are they living in? They still cling to such primitive ideas. Their civilization must be young. Perhaps some fortuitous encounter accelerated their technological progress, but their ancient instincts for close combat and hunting clearly remain ingrained. These thoughts fed a growing sense of superiority. That explains why their bioweapons excel at close quarters combat. They have a clear preference for hand-to-hand fighting. Welcome, guests of the Troy. A deep voice cut through Buller's musings, snapping him back to reality. The momentary surge of superiority quickly receded. After all, he was standing in the heart of enemy territory. Angering the host here would likely lead to disastrous consequences. Thankfully, the protective suit concealed his facial expressions, preventing any offense from being detected. Moreover, the swarm's greeting as guests, while not friends, hinted at a mutual understanding. The Troy had no desire to waste resources and manpower clashing with the swarm over this mission. Likewise, the swarm likely wished to avoid offending the Confederation unnecessarily. With this shared foundation, negotiations could proceed. Buller's mind raced. How can I secure the greatest possible benefit for the Empire? Although the Troy were the dominant power in the Outer Ring, they had only extended invitations to 3 civilizations in their history. Each instance left a significant mark on their annals. If this invitation to the swarm could be managed diplomatically, maximizing benefits while maintaining dignity, the operation would undoubtedly become a historical milestone. While the top brass would claim most of the credit, as the first to engage the swarm, Buller knew his name would also be recorded in glory. Refocusing, Buller noticed a subtle detail: the swarm representative was speaking in Rican, a language shared between them. That made sense after all. Even if the swarm used their own language, he wouldn't understand it. Using a mutually comprehensible tongue was practical. However, this wasn't what stood out most. The significant point was that the voice wasn't being amplified or transmitted through any devices. Instead, it carried naturally through the air. Admittedly, even that wasn't extraordinary. Creating a habitable ecological chamber within their own base would be trivial for the swarm. What truly stood out to Buller was that the representative wasn't wearing a breathing mask. Their facial features were fully exposed, indicating the room's atmospheric conditions were breathable for them. Buller immediately activated the analyzer built into his protective suit. This tool, a standard feature of such suits, was designed to analyze the composition of the atmosphere on alien planets, ensuring safe disembarkation. Atmospheric analysis was crucial. By examining the air composition, it was possible to approximate the environmental conditions of the host species. The Interstellar Technological Confederation maintained atmospheric samples from thousands of planets across over 10,000 star systems. If the swarm's environment matched an existing sample, it would reveal where they originated. If not, it would suggest that the swarm were an extragalactic species that had somehow ended up in this galaxy. This discovery could have profound implications. Although the swarm representative's posture was upright and exuded a harmonious aesthetic, Buller couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. However, he had no time to dwell on this unease. Everything he had just thought and done, the activation of the analyzer and his observations, had taken place in mere moments. The analysis results would take much longer, but Buller needed to respond now. Greetings. I am Buller of the Troy civilization, a member of the Interstellar Technological Confederation. It is an honor to meet you, he said, performing a high-level Troy greeting gesture. Although the swarm likely wouldn't understand the significance of the gesture now, if they ever joined the Confederation, this kind of basic etiquette would be recorded in the annals of various civilizations. By showing respect now, Buller could avoid potential accusations of rudeness in the future, a preemptive measure to prevent unnecessary conflicts. What is your purpose here? The deep voice asked, and the lead male swarm representative made a motion, which Buller interpreted as a gesture of swarm etiquette. I come in the spirit of friendship and hope to gain yours as well, Buller replied. The purpose of his visit, of course, was obvious from both the information gathered from the Daki and the broadcasts made by the Troy fleet. However, it was still necessary to formally ask and clarify the intent. Diplomatic protocol demanded explicit exchanges. This was not a place for guessing games. The swarm representative nodded and made a universal please gesture, indicating the chairs behind them. From the gesture and the crude furniture's design, the meaning was unmistakable. Thanks to Buller's humble and respectful demeanor, the initial interaction was free of hostility. Both sides sat down in a relatively amicable atmosphere. The chair-like objects, while wild in design and adhering to the swarm's untamed aesthetic, thankfully lacked the soft, fleshy materials Buller had feared. As he nervously lowered himself onto the seat, the firm surface beneath him brought unexpected relief, and he unconsciously exhaled. As both parties settled in, Buller finally had a moment to observe the room more closely. His protective suit had built-in scanning capabilities, but it was already stretching boundaries to analyze the air composition subtly. Overtly using his scanner to survey the surroundings would be considered highly arrogant and provocative in any civilization. No one with even a shred of diplomacy would make such a blunder. That said, there wasn't much worth scanning in this room. The walls were lined with mysterious, faintly glowing purple plants, giving the dim space an eerie, organic ambience. Thanks to the advanced optics in his suit's visor, which included low-light vision as a basic feature, Buller could see clearly despite the dim lighting. A quick glance confirmed the simplicity of the room. It was essentially a large cavern, roughly 400 to 500 square meters in size, devoid of unnecessary decorations. There was nothing here that remotely suggested advanced technology. If Buller didn't already know the swarm's overwhelming combat capabilities, he might have mistaken this place for the den of primitive creatures on a feral planet. Chapter 389, The Genesis Swarm. Is this really necessary? Buller couldn't help but complain internally. He wasn't sure if the opposing party genuinely lived in such an environment or if they had deliberately arranged the venue this way to express some kind of primitive reverence. Buller guessed it was the latter. One of the hallmarks of technological progress is to enhance convenience in life. If a civilization had advanced to the point of conquering star systems, yet still resided in primitive caves, Buller knew he couldn't tolerate it. If this were the Troy civilization, it would undoubtedly be a grand and imposing metallic hall, complete with amplifiers, translators, large video screens, hostesses for protocol, and refreshments, everything in order. While other civilizations might differ in details, none would go so far as to be this rudimentary. Buller could only comfort himself by thinking this was part of their tradition, a very high-standard reception. As he shifted his gaze back to the swarm members in attendance, that strange feeling he had earlier once again washed over him. Buller's brows furrowed. His chiseled and angular face took on a contemplative expression. Suddenly, he finally realized what was amiss. The proportions of the opposing party were too perfect. Yes, that was it. This was what made Buller feel uneasy. Normally, even if a protective suit sacrificed some functionality for the sake of being lightweight and form-fitting, there would still be visible signs at the joints. For instance, if he were to remove his helmet now, his head would appear slightly smaller against the backdrop of the protective suit, and the collar of the suit would be clearly noticeable. Yet, as Buller observed the male swarm member seated before him from every angle, he saw no such indications. The armor seemed to be seamlessly integrated with its body, flawless in every way. Even after scrutinizing the neck area for a long time, he couldn't detect any anomalies. Could it be that this armor wasn't something the swarm wore, but rather something they were born with? Were those intricate spikes and decorations not useless ornaments but natural extensions of their bodies? An absurd thought suddenly popped into Buller's mind. He quickly shook his head to dispel it. Impossible. Even if a species had been highly aggressive during its primitive era, evolution tends to diminish such traits as they develop tools, cognitive abilities, and technology. Their physical strength, endurance, and speed would all decline, let alone retain such external weaponry. Typically, at most, they would retain features like fangs or claws. This trend would continue until the species made a breakthrough in biotechnology. With the aid of certain chemical enhancements, they could regain strength, endurance, and speed. But the likelihood of re-embracing aggressive external features was slim. Could this biological path really be so wild that they even restored these attributes? Unbelievable. If this armor was indeed reminiscent of their ancestors' appearance during ancient times, the combat capabilities of a fully armored form must reflect an environment of unimaginable harshness. What kind of peril would necessitate such extreme adaptations? It was plausible. The fact that the swarm members could breathe naturally in this room implied that this was their natural habitat. If so, their ability to function in this environment without additional gear seemed reasonable. Wait. Something about this thought felt off. If this hypothesis were correct, wouldn't that mean this armor was essentially their skin, and they were currently not wearing any clothing? No, no. That couldn't be right. How could they appear in such an important setting in such a manner? Regardless of the species, once they reached a level of civilization, they should comprehend the concept of modesty, shouldn't they? But as he observed the swarm member, it seemed like there wasn't anything inappropriate about their appearance. Or was it simply a difference in perception between species? If Buller stripped completely and stood here now, would they even notice which parts of his body shouldn't be exposed? Probably. Buller's thoughts became increasingly chaotic. He had a gut feeling that this was an important question, but he couldn't figure out why. His instincts were usually spot on, and he trusted them implicitly. Sitting across from Buller, Danton felt a chill run down his neck under Buller's intense and unblinking gaze. Uncomfortably, he reached up to rub his neck, wondering if the Troy species had some kind of mental disorder. Kai, noticing Danton's reaction, sensed something was off. The Major General she admired seemed to have lost his composure. She quickly tugged at Buller's protective suit, snapping him out of his daze. However, her curiosity was piqued what exactly had captured the Major General's attention so thoroughly. Looking at the ferocious horn-like protrusions and the wild, violent appearance of the keratinous exoskeleton, Kai pondered silently. Was it these features? Did the Major General have a particular liking for them? She mused privately, wondering if she should consider ordering a custom suit for herself. One must admit, while the Troy species both male and female were all burly and muscular, their thoughts were astonishingly whimsical and imaginative. Was this some kind of racial trait? Coming back to his senses, Buller also realized his loss of composure. Quickly, he cleared his mind of the chaotic thoughts. After a brief cough to cover his embarrassment, he took the initiative to ask, "May I know how to address you and your species?" Up until now, the Interstellar Technological Confederation had no idea what the swarm actually called themselves. The name swarm had been coined by the Riken species and subsequently adopted by everyone else. However, in formal diplomatic settings, it was only proper to ask the species in question what they preferred to be called. Assigning them a nickname and sticking to it would hardly be respectful. "You may call us the Genesis Swarm. We are quite fond of that name. As for myself, I am Danton, a Major General, responsible for this diplomatic mission," Danton replied. His voice was low, raspy, and resonant, as if processed through multiple layers of reverberation. As for the species' official name, although Luo Wen was fond of the term swarm, it was only natural for a species to have its own name after years of development. Adopting a nickname created by others would seem unprincipled and invite scorn. Thus, while swarm could remain part of the designation, it needed a proper prefix. Initially, Luo Wen had considered using Ifi-ish, but upon further reflection, he decided against it. That name was part of his original foundation. Even though this universe likely had no connection to the wizarding continent he came from, there was always a possibility, however slim. Even if the universes were unrelated, his ability to traverse worlds suggested that other unknown entities could potentially do the same. If any records of Ifi-ish existed and surfaced, they might expose his origins and secrets. Granted, in the wizarding continent, Ifi-ish was more myth than reality, with few reliable accounts. Cautious by nature, Luo Wen had decided to use Genesis as the prefix after careful consideration. Within the swarm itself, Genesis Planet and Genesis System were internal designations. To the outside world, the Genesis System was known by other names, such as T-83 System among the Riken. Thus, this choice wouldn't reveal much. Genesis? Swarm. Buller murmured, repeating the names to himself. Chapter 390, Mutual Interests. Genesis? Swarm. Buller repeated softly. Genesis? That name carried a certain weight, but it wasn't entirely unprecedented. Plenty of species had grandiose names. For example, the Troy civilization itself, while the name Troy meant nothing to other cultures, in their own language, it signified masters of the world, which far outshined something like Genesis. However, from Danton's brief introduction, Buller was able to glean a considerable amount of information. First, Danton had said that we liked the name. Due to the swarm's previous aura of mystery, some external analysts had speculated that the swarm might have evolved from a kind of social organism. These analysts believed that the space octopuses were merely swarm drones, devoid of independent thought, operating solely under the control of a single will. But this theory had been strongly contested. On the homeworlds of many alien species, there were examples of social organisms that evolved during their planetary ecosystem's development. Such species had members that followed the will of a central leader, with individual units almost completely devoid of self-awareness, mechanically executing tasks. While these groups displayed unparalleled unity and collaboration, none of them had ever evolved into an advanced species. In their primitive eras, such creatures could dominate due to their collective strength, but once other species began developing intelligence, they were quickly outpaced. Put simply, as long as no one had developed brains, these organisms could rely on their cohesion to hold the upper hand. But once intelligence came into play, the disadvantage of a species having only one brain became apparent. No matter how brilliant that one mind might be, it could never outmatch the collective brain power of thousands or millions. With examples from countless planets as evidence, this theory was eventually discarded. However, a minority of people argued that the universe was vast and full of wonders, continuing to support the idea. Before undertaking this mission, Buller had devoted significant effort to researching the swarm not just for his career prospects but also for his survival. He reviewed every piece of data, video, text, and analysis on the swarm no fewer than 10 times. Thus, the moment Danton used the term "we," Buller immediately picked up on it. The swarm couldn't be a singular will species. While this conclusion could already be inferred from the simultaneous presence of 3 swarm members and various other details, hearing it directly confirmed was much more conclusive. Second, Danton introduced himself by name, further supporting this inference. While it was possible that the swarm was numerically scarce, it was clearly not to the extent of having only one individual. Lastly, Danton mentioned his military rank Major General. Though he used the term in Riken, this suggested that the swarm had a hierarchical structure. Danton also emphasized that he was responsible for handling this diplomatic mission. A Major General would typically be a military officer, whereas diplomats among most species were usually civil officials. Buller wasn't sure if the swarm had sent a Major General as a gesture of reciprocity, given that he himself was a Major General, or if there simply wasn't a more precise term in Riken to describe Danton's position. Buller mentally catalogued these observations, planning to subtly probe for more details if an opportunity arose during future conversations. Thus, this diplomatic meeting stretched on for nearly a month. During this time, Buller and Danton discussed many topics and solidified numerous agreements. The most significant outcome was that the swarm would join the Interstellar Technological Confederation. At the very least, this meant the main objective of the talks had been achieved. Buller was already envisioning his bright future upon his return, promotions, pay raises, and a meteoric rise to glory. Consequently, the 300-pound giant and his equally massive beautiful adjutant, along with their similarly hefty colleagues, were all in high spirits. Additionally, there were finer details. The swarm had earned respect through its own strength, distinguishing itself from the fledgling civilizations that were defeated and subsequently pillaged. The swarm would still abide by the Confederation's rules. For example, the first batch of researchers dispatched to the G species would have their contributions tallied into the Confederation's points system, with the Troy civilization taking the lion's share of the rewards. However, Danton made it clear not to expect a significant number of researchers. This was merely a symbolic gesture, a reciprocal acknowledgement for the Troy civilization's decision to pursue peace instead of war. The Troy civilization understood this dynamic. Initially, realizing they lacked the strength to conquer the swarm, they opted for a peaceful negotiation. While this was primarily to preserve their own resources, it also benefited the swarm. As a result, the swarm offered a token of goodwill, providing a diplomatic middle ground. The Troy civilization could publicly declare that they had successfully invited the swarm to join the Confederation, and the swarm, in turn, could join the Confederation in accordance with established rules without appearing excessively unconventional. This arrangement allowed both parties to save face, avoid conflict, and preserve their strength. Another point of discussion involved the Riken and ratfolk species. The Riken species had reached the technological threshold for an invitation to the Confederation, while the ratfolk were still some distance away from meeting the standards. Previously, both species had respective sponsoring civilizations for potential membership. However, with the swarm joining the Confederation, they became the nearest member civilization to both species, thus inheriting the right to invite them. This could lead to minor disputes, such as protests from the Daki species or even some conflicts. Buller stated that the Confederation wouldn't intervene in such matters, these issues would need to be resolved independently. Danton, however, dismissed these concerns as trivial. At this point, the major issues surrounding the swarm's membership in the Confederation had been resolved. The remaining minor matters were easily manageable. The lengthy negotiations had primarily been due to two reasons. First, Buller, a recently promoted Major General, was little more than a sacrificial pawn. Officially referred to as a diplomat, he was, in reality, expendable. If the swarm turned out to be temperamental, there was no chance he would make it back alive. As a result, Buller had very limited authority, with hardly any decisions under his purview. He was merely a tool, sent to the swarm to establish a communication channel. Once the channel was set up, Buller essentially became a relay, passing information between the two sides. Second, given the uncertainty surrounding the swarm's disposition, a quantum communication device was installed on Buller's ship to ensure smooth communication. This piece of equipment, even by Troy standards, was extraordinarily expensive and classified under Confederation technology protection protocols. As such, it was heavily secured, with its operation room equipped with multiple recognition devices that only Buller could access. Every day, Buller had to clock in at the operation room and check that all recognition devices were functioning correctly. If he failed to clock in at the designated time or if the recognition devices were tampered with, the ship, the operation room, and the device itself would immediately trigger a triple self-destruct protocol.